Welcome to today's Holocaust Living History Workshop featuring the internationally renowned historian Michael Brenner. I would like to thank the European Studies program at UC San Diego for their contribution to today's event. As always, it is a pleasure to acknowledge the UC San Diego Library and the Jewish Studies program for their support. I would also like to extend a special welcome to my students. I hope many of you are here who are joining, my students from the Holocaust course. I particularly recommended this event to them because I know it's going to be very enlightening. Professor Brenner's presentation will be followed by a question and answer session. Please submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I will keep track of the questions. And now, without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Frank Bies, Rita L. Atkinson Endowed Chair in German Studies at UC San Diego, who will now introduce our distinguished guest. Frank, please.
Yeah, thank you, Susanne, and good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to introduce Michael or Michael Brenner, depending on where he is residing at the moment, because he's a scholar who's truly at home in two academic cultures, in Germany and in the US. He was born in Germany, but got his PhD at Columbia, then taught at Indiana University and at Brandeis, before he got the chair for Jewish history and culture at the University of Munich in 1997, at a very young age for a German professor. Since 2013, he also holds a position at American University in Washington, D.C., where I understand he currently is. So he speaks to us from our capital. And he is a distinguished professor of history and the Abensohn chair in Israel studies there. I just told him I find it difficult enough to manage the demands of one job. So I think it's truly stunning how he can actually have two jobs on two different continents, although he just told me that he's just taken a short leave of absence from his German job and now is mainly focused on his job at American University. Among his many honors and awards, the most impressive one is perhaps the one that he won at the age of 17, when he won the first prize of the German-wide Federal President's History Competition. Wikipedia says there were 13,000 competitors, and he won that prize. This obviously was an auspicious beginning for a brilliant academic career that led him to become arguably the leading historian of German Jewish history in Germany and one of the leading historians of Jewish life and culture worldwide. Later awards include the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany in 2014 and the Salo W. and Jeanette M. Barron Award for Scholarly Excellence in Research on the Jewish Experience in 2020. I cannot recount all of his books because he wrote too many of them, but I would just like to mention some of my favorite books. And they're actually some of his earlier books. The first one on the Renaissance of Jewish culture in Weimar, Germany, I think a revised version of his dissertation published by Yale University Press in 1996, the seminal book, I think, on Jewish life in Weimar, Germany. And then just 1 year later, after the Holocaust, Rebuilding Jewish Lives in Post-War Germany, also an extremely important book. More recently, he's written on Jewish and Israeli history more broadly, including A Short History of the Jews, Princeton, 2010, Zionism, A Brief History, and in 2018, In Search of Israel, also Princeton University Press. But luckily, he never abandoned his interest in German history and returned to that subject with his latest book, which is entitled In Hitler's Munich, Jews, the Revolution, and the Rise of Nazism, which was published by Princeton University Press in 2022. And his talk today will be drawn from this book. So again, Michael, thank you so much for joining us. We would much prefer to have you here in person, but just to have you on the screen is quite a treat as well. So thank you for taking the time to talk to us tonight.
Well, thank you, Frank, for a most generous introduction. And believe me, I would rather be there too. I think we have about 28 or 29 degrees at the moment in DC, besides the other bad weather we have here politically. But it's good to be with you, at least virtually. The topic today is the topic of my last book, entitled in Hitler's Munich, Jews, the Revolution, and the Rise of Nazism. And I guess those of you who are not that familiar with German history might ask, which revolution? So let's start. I am sharing my screen, and the revolution we are talking about is the revolution of 1918, of November 1918, which coincides with the end of World War I. As I'm sure many of you know, when the war ended, that also meant the end of the monarchy, or better, the monarchies in Germany and all the German states. It wasn't just the emperor, but also the kings and princes in the various German states that resigned after the end of the war, or that had to resign because there was a revolution. Now, you may ask, is there something like this, a peaceful revolution? Well, if we define revolution as the change of regime in this case, from monarchy to a republic, yes, and indeed, the revolution that happened in Munich on November 7th and 8th, 1918, and you may notice it's actually one day before the revolution in Berlin. For once, the Bavarians were faster than the Prussians. The revolution that happened in November of 1918 in Munich happened without basically losing one drop of blood. And I think this report of the administrator of the royal palace, called Jakob Wilner, says a lot about how it happened. He described it later. When the most sovereign gentleman had left that residence, I shut the windows in the royal palace, helped extinguish the lights, and after the officiant on duty and the footman, who had no further instructions, had left, I closed all the doors and made my way to the chapel courtyard. I mean, this is just two sentences out of a long description, which showed, well, it's actually happened, it happened really without violence. The king, the Bavarian king, Ludwig III, he was told to leave Bavaria because there is a revolution happening. And where did the revolution start? Well, it's at a place where many things happen in Munich, and that's the picture on the left. The big statue called the Bavaria, that big lady, and it is at the spot where every year the most important event happens in Munich, and that, of course, is the Oktoberfest. So on the Theresienwiese, on this big meadow, there were two protests or two demonstrations happening on November 7th, 1918, both in favor of ending the war and creating a republic instead of a monarchy. One was organized by what was called then the Majority Social Democratic Party, because the Social Democratic Party had split in the middle of World War I about the question, over the question of pacifism, of stopping the war or continuing the war. The majority Social Democrats said, well, we are more patriots than socialists, we continue the war. And a minority called the Independent Social Democrats, or in German, the USPD, they wanted to stop the war already in 1916 and certainly 1917. So we had both of these protests happening in the same place next to each other. A large one of the majority, Social Democrats because they were more, and the smaller one of the independent Social Democrats. Now, the difference was what happened when it got dark in the evening. The majority Social Democrats, the more moderate ones, they told their people, well, demonstration is over, you can go home. The independent Social Democrats, a much smaller group, under the leadership of someone we'll talk a little more in a moment, a journalist called Kurt Eisner. And Eisner said, well, let's march on and go into the city. And, some way to their surprise, they didn't have to act like revolutionaries. They found that the soldiers, and there were many soldiers, also not locals, stationed in Munich at the time, they came to their support. They wanted nothing more than end the war, and they were not happy with the king. And then many of the peasants, of the farmers who were in the city, also came to their support, and the workers out of their factories. So without actually much planning that night, it was clear that the city rallied behind this journalist called Kurt Eisner. He's in the middle here. And he was three things that you would not necessarily take for granted for a German politician. He was for a Bavarian politician, he was a Prussian, and there was an old animosity between Bavarians and Prussians. So he was a Prussian from Berlin, he was a Jew, and he was a socialist. And that was a combination that, was quite unlikely for a person who would now declare the Free State of Bavaria. Where did he declare it? Well, it was too late to be outside at the Bavaria. So the other place you go in Munich are the beer halls. So it was in one of the beer halls where he declared the Free State of Bavaria. By the way, it's until today, the name of the state is the Free State of Bavaria. Even though I must say, most of the leading politicians of Bavaria have a hard time recognizing that I think the Prussian and Jew is maybe a little less of a problem, but that a socialist founded their free state because Bavaria has been ruled for the last 70 years or so by the Conservative Party. And when a few years ago, the 100th anniversary happened in November of 2018, the 100th anniversary of the Free State of Bavaria, Kurt Eisner, its founder, was not mentioned even with one word by the then and today Bavarian Prime Minister Söder. So much for the background of November 19. I want to talk a little more about Eisner and his associates. Eisner, as I already said, was a journalist from Berlin. He had lived in Bavaria for quite a while, first in Nuremberg and then in Munich. He was, for a while, the main editor of the German Social Democratic newspaper Vorwärts, and he was then the main editor of a Bavarian Social Democratic paper. He was not a household name in Germany and even in Munich, I would say, until the beginning of 1918, when he was one of the main organizers of a strike of ammunition workers, men and women, by the way, many women among them. And it's also interesting, he was actually sentenced to because the middle of the war, and he organizes a strike of ammunition workers. So, of course, that was seen as sabotage by many. And he was supposed to serve. He did serve a prison sentence. Interestingly, because he was the candidate to run for elections, a political figure, he was let out of prison. How did he become what was called, and is still called, prime minister? In America, maybe we would call it governor, because it's a German state, but it was quite independent. How did he become prime minister? in the first place in November of 1918. There were no elections, obviously, in the middle of this, revolutionary chaos. There were councils of workers, of farmers, and of soldiers. And they met and they elected him as the first prime minister. We have a lot to talk about, so I unfortunately can't go much into his achievements in his time as prime minister, his achievements and maybe also what he didn't achieve. But I'd be happy to answer, of course, questions. He, not surprisingly, was also from the first day he took office, the target of right-wing, extreme right-wing forces. As a Prussian, but especially as a socialist and as a Jew. And I was able to see in his archives, in his, there in Berlin, there are two huge folders with letters to him, and 95% of those letters are not positive. These are letters denouncing him, some of them threatening to attack or even to murder him, many of them with anti-Semitic content. There was no Jewish leading politician in Germany before 1918, never. Yes, there were members of parliament, but no minister was ever appointed in the German Reich or in Prussia or in Bavaria, ever. And so to have the head of the state now as a person who is Jewish, and, even if he was not religious, which of course he wasn't, as a socialist and as somebody who grew up in a very assimilated family, but he was very consciously Jewish and he never denied it. He was a secular Jew, as we would say today. And these letters were very interesting. But there was another kind of letters also, letters written by Jews. And they were also mainly negative in the sense that they expressed a certain scare. And I'll come back to that in a minute when we talk about the Jewish community. So Eisner was under a lot of pressure from the beginning. One of the reasons was that he also said, well, we should admit that Germany started that war. That did not come across well in 1918-19, even much later it didn't. And when the first historian in the 1950s in Germany claimed that Germany was responsible for the war, there was a huge historians' debate in Germany. So in 1918-19, that was seen as very provocative, and Eisner was denounced as a traitor. So he did declare the election. He did call for elections. Elections took place pretty fast in January of 1919. His independent Social Democrats did not well. In all of Bavaria, they got 2.5%. In Munich, it was considerably more, but it was clear he had no mandate to continue as prime minister. On February 21st, 1919, he was on the way to the Bavarian parliament with a letter in his jacket, and the letter was his resignation speech. But on the way to the parliament, he was shot, he was assassinated by a 20-year-old young aristocrat called Count von Arco, Anton von Arco. And it's an interesting story. Von Arco wrote a letter because he thought he would be killed in the process. And he wrote a letter why he did it. And among other reasons, he said a Jew should not be prime minister of a German state. Interestingly, when we look into Arco's history, well, I said he was an aristocrat. That was from his father's side. From his mother's side, she was born von Oppenheim. That was an old Jewish banker's family. They were already Protestant. They had already been baptized 2 generations before him. But when this young Graf or Count von Arco applied to be a member in one of these new right-wing extremist organizations called the Thule Society, they rejected him because he wasn't a pure Aryan for them. So one of the motives he had to shot the Jewish prime minister was to prove himself to them as worthy of being part of a right-wing extremist organization. You see here a group of soldiers at the site where Eisner was shot. And on the right side, you see part of the funeral procession, which was the largest Munich had ever seen to the day, with reportedly 100,000 people walking behind Eisner's coffin. Eisner was not the only Jewish person in the revolution. I'm actually starting here. I would, and I argue in my book, well, you don't have to argue, it's pretty obvious, that in Munich, most of the leading revolutionaries in the first phase, and then we come to a second phase of the revolution, happened to be Jewish. Besides Eisner, let me just show you here the faces of the 4, I would say, most important revolutionaries between November 1918 and May 1919. Gustav Landauer on the left, on top of the left, and then if we go in clockwise, Ernst Toller, Erich Mühsam, and Eugen Leviné, who was the leader of a communist phase, of the last phase of this revolution. The 3 others, Landauer, Toller, and Mühsam, were also known as prominent writers and intellectuals in Germany, and their works are still read. I would say especially Toller's plays are still performed and read, but also Mühsam and Landauer were very important intellectuals. I want to say a few more words about Gustav Landauer, not just because his grandson, as much as I can't see anyone, unfortunately, but I think his grandson, Robert Nichols, is with us today. We had a nice exchange before. But to me, Gustav Landauer was the most fascinating of all of these revolutionaries, certainly when it comes to the Jewish dimension. One of the reasons is his very close friendship with Martin Buber. At some point, he said nobody else had influenced him so much as Martin Buber, who was the most important German Jewish philosopher, I would say, in the 20th century. They were very close, and partly, I would say, through Buber's influence, Landauer became sympathetic to Zionism. I wouldn't call him a Zionist, but he was sympathetic to the Zionist cause. He was very engaged in the cause of East European refugees in Berlin. He wrote about an institution called the Volksheim, which was an institution for especially children, East European children, who were in this home in Berlin. And he took really a great interest in intellectual Jewish matters as a secular Jew, like all of them. And one of the, there's so many interesting documents you find when you go through the books and the archives and the letters. And on December 2nd, I thought, what a line. Landauer writes to Buber, "Dear Buber, a very fine theme, the revolution and the Jews. Make sure to treat the leading part the Jews have played in the upheaval." So basically, he tells Buber, go and write the story of the revolution and write about the role the Jews played in there, because everybody could see it. The truth is, Buber didn't write it, and nobody wrote it, besides the anti-Semites, who always used it for obvious reasons. And I think that's the obvious reason why historians, until, I think I started writing the book, until historians were a little hesitant to mention the fact that the most significant players of this revolution all happened to be Jewish. So I was inspired in a way by this line that Landauer wrote to Buber. Buber was, as I said, very close to Landauer, and he visited him in Munich in February of 1919, and he happened to be in Munich when Eisner was shot. He was on his way out of Munich at the train station. He writes to his friend and later son-in-law, Ludwig Strauss, the whole thing an unspeakable Jewish tragedy. And in a way, the more I got into the topic, the more it was a Jewish tragedy, because it wasn't just the revolutionaries who happened to be Jewish. Now you have figures on the other side who, or on the many other sides, there weren't only two sides, there were the moderate social democrats, there were the right-wingers. Now, the right-wingers were not Jews per se, but people like Arco, who, because of their partially Jewish background, acted as they acted. And you had a lot of people watching this and making some kind of snotty or anti-Semitic remark, even people who were, not necessarily anti-Semitic. Take Thomas Mann. Thomas Mann was already by then one of the most important German writers. He would, in the 1920s, then receive the Nobel Prize in Literature. He lived in Munich at the time. He was from northern Germany, he lived in Munich. And he was married to Katja Pringsheim, who was from a Munich Jewish family. But he has a lot of remarks in this time which weren't very favorable about the Jews. I just wrote down one of them here. Both Munich and Bavaria are governed by Jewish scribblers. How long will the city put up with that? Well, the city did not put up very long with that, as we could see. And I'm just trying to skip this. Let's just, for a moment, look what the Jewish community in Munich had to say, because none of those revolutionaries, and I could mention a few more than the ones I showed in the pictures, none of them were locals. They were all Germans, besides, well, even Levine, he was born in Moscow, his parents were German Jews. So they were all German Jews, but not from Bavaria. The local Jewish community was very reserved because they were, first of all, they were not revolutionaries. Many of them were conservative or moderate, maybe moderate social democrats, but not so much to the left. It was a very conservative middle-class population. By the way, the picture you see in the foreground is the synagogue of Munich, built in 1889. And you can see, depending on where you stand, of course, on the perspective, together with the symbol of Munich, the Frauenkirche, the Ladies' Cathedral in the background, it was quite a significant building. So there was a saying not in Munich, but in Moscow, the Trotskys make the revolution and the Bronsteins pay the price. Of course, Trotsky's actual real name was Bronstein, very Jewish name. And the people who said, supposedly it was the chief rabbi of Moscow who said it first, it means, Trotsky makes the revolution, but the Jews have to pay the price, because even if people like Trotsky are not associating themselves with the Jewish community, the others will associate them with them. They will see him as not just Trotsky the revolutionary, but Trotsky the Jew. So one of the leaders of the Munich Jewish community and of the Orthodox community person by the name of Frankl, Sigmund Frankl, wrote a letter in the midst of this revolutionary events to the paper, the newspaper in Munich, where he distanced himself and his community from the revolutionaries very openly. And I'm just reading one sentence out of a long letter where he says, Bavaria's indigenous Jews, you know, these others, they are strangers. They come from Berlin and Karlsruhe and other places. Bavaria's indigenous Jews shout out, by way of me, to Bavaria's population, our hands are clean of the horrors of chaos and of the misery and suffering that your politics must conjure up over Bavaria's future development. You, speaking to the Jewish revolutionaries, you and you alone bear full responsibility for this. So Frankl said, in a way, what a large part of the Jewish community thought. If this experiment is failing, if this revolution is failing, we will be made responsible for it as Jews. And indeed, that happened. Maybe a small, just an afterthought or footnote to Frankl's letter. When it was published actually only a year later. They didn't publish it in 1919. In 1920, it was published. And one of the revolutionaries, the one to the right, at the bottom right, Erich Mühsam. Erich Mühsam was in prison already at the time for his participation in the revolution. And somebody gave him that letter by Frankl, which was printed in the Munich newspaper. And I found it interesting that Mühsam, who also was a very secular Jew, took the effort from prison to publish an article in a left-wing intellectual journal, Die Weltbühne, where he answered as a Jew. He responded saying, and I'm paraphrasing now, this bourgeois merchant, Sigmund Frankl, he may call himself an Orthodox Jew, but he is not true. He doesn't live to the values of real Judaism, of the ideas of the biblical prophets. They were all about socialism and equality and helping the poor people and the small people. And we are much more true to the real Jewish spirit. I found this a fascinating letter. It's so different, by the way, from people like Trotsky or Rosa Luxemburg, the main Jewish person in the Berlin Revolution, who kind of distanced themselves from their Jewishness. In Munich, for whatever reason, people like Mühsam and Landauer and even Eisner and Toller did not distance themselves. They didn't see themselves first as Jews, obviously not, but they took it as part of their identity. And Mühsam said this here and at other places too. Just to end the story of the revolution. So Eisner was killed in February of 1919. There was, after that, kind of a period of chaos where different forces, the more moderate and the more radical left-wing, fought each other. And for a few weeks in April of 1919, or for the whole month of April, there was what was called a Council Republic, or you might also call it Soviet Republic, because Soviet is the Russian word for council, which was more, the first one was more kind of left-wing anarchist, with leaders like Gustav Landauer, who was the Minister of Education, Ernst Toller, who was responsible for the military, and Erich Mühsam also. The second phase, after only a week or so, now became really more radical and more left-wing, and was led by this person below on the left side, Eugen Leviné. Leviné was a communist. He wanted already a Moscow-style revolution. They all failed, and by May 1st, 1919, the right-wing forces, many of them called in from Berlin and especially from Württemberg in the south, marched into Munich and put it. Now the revolution, or the counter-revolution, became bloody, and that was a very violent matter. In fact, Gustav Landauer had a cruel death, was murdered in a cruel way on May 2nd of 1919 in Munich. Toller survived only because he was able to hide. He was later imprisoned, just as Erich Mühsam, and both were arrested and served prison sentences. Later, in 1933, Mühsam was now already in Nazi Germany, was put in a concentration camp and murdered, and Ernst Toller emigrated to New York and died by suicide in 1939. The one on the left bottom, the leader of the communist part of the Council Republic, Eugen Leviné, he was actually executed in June of 1919, one of the very few people executed in Germany, in Weimar Germany, for political reasons. But again, an interesting story. What happened? He was buried at the Jewish cemetery. The others weren't, by the way. Landauer, there's a whole story about his grave because the Nazis later moved it to the Jewish cemetery, but in 1919, he was not buried in the Jewish cemetery. Neither was Eisner. But Leviné, the most radical and most left-wing and communist one, was buried there. And the rabbi of Munich, who was actually a monarchist, he regretted that the king was no longer there, gave a sermon, or had to give a sermon, when at the funeral of the communist Leviné at the Jewish cemetery. And his grave is, of course, still there. So it's very interesting if you go to Munich and visit the Jewish cemetery, because now you have the grave of Leviné, the communist, but also of Eisner and Landauer, because in 1933, citizens who were ardent Nazis wrote to the city council, now also Nazi, we cannot bury our, German relatives at this cemetery where the Jews, Eisner and Landauer, are buried. And the Jewish community had to rebury them on their grounds. And till today, their graves are also at the Jewish cemetery. I want to say now a few words about how things continued. I must say, when I wrote the book, I actually intended initially just to write about the revolution, but it was clear you can't stop there, because the events after the revolution really led to the rise of Hitler and the National Socialist movement. In 1920, Bavaria is in the hands of conservatives, mainly politicians, of course, because politicians are the important actors in any state. And the person now, the rising star, is kind of a mediocre civil servant by the name of Gustav von Kahr, who became first he became prime minister in 1920, and in 1923 he was made kind of a real dictator. He got dictatorial powers. Didn't last very long, but we'll come back to that in our last act. So von Kahr, a right-wing politician, not a Nazi, but a conservative politician, is kind of the leading person in politics. But we should not forget that at the same time in Munich, there were other important players besides the politicians or the elected politicians. It's a very Catholic city, and the Catholic Church plays also politically an important role. And it was the Archbishop. First he was bishop, and then first he was Archbishop, then he was Cardinal, Michael Faulhaber, who was such an important player in Munich. He was in his position between 1917 and his death in the 1950s. So he started out in Imperial Germany, then was cardinal in the Weimar Germany period, then in Nazi Germany, and then in post-war West Germany as well. And only a few years ago, his diaries were found. By the way, it's very hard to read them. I cannot read them. They're written in Gabelsberger Kurzschrift. It's one of those shorthands, which very few people today, I think, can read. It's almost like hieroglyphs. So you need to be a specialist, but they're all luckily being transcribed and put on and are out on the internet on the website. And it's very interesting because what we knew that he had theological, problems with the Jews, accepting the Jews as equals, but that there was more anti-Semitic motives we didn't know so well. But when you read the diaries, it becomes pretty clear. It's not so surprising that when a Jewish socialist becomes prime minister, he would say something like, it is not the same whether the people look up to a king with trust and a sense of religious obligation, or whether they say, what does this Jew have to say to us, has to do with us, sorry. That, doesn't surprise us so much. 1918, 1919, an archbishop, Catholic, he's not fond of a Jewish revolutionary replacing a Catholic king of a dynasty that had ruled Bavaria for 700 years. But when we come, and we'll discuss it in a moment, to anti-Semitic riots that happened in Munich, and he does not come to the help of the Jews, we didn't really know about this so well. Because, for example, the chief rabbi of Munich, the same one who gave the eulogy for the communist Leviné, he visited Faulhaber a few times, and he wrote letters saying, well, the archbishop, I think I found his ear. He listened to me. He'll help us. Now we know what Faulhaber actually thought, because he wrote in his diary, he said, always those Jews come to me. I can't do anything for them. And why would I do something for them? They can help themselves. They have all the money. I mean, I'm paraphrasing here. But that was kind of the sense we get from his diary entries. So he was not inclined to help the Jews. And obviously, as we know, they could not help themselves. The same, by the way, with von Kahr, the conservative politician, the prime minister, and later I call him small dictator of Bavaria. Again, not happy that there was a Jewish prime minister in 1918. The Bavarian people, he said, was letting itself be enticed and terrorized by the Prussian Jew and his clan. And his clan, he means the other Jews. Again, how do we know that? There is a 1,000-page memoir. It's not published, but there's a manuscript of a 1,000-page memoir of von Kahr. Very interesting because, again, it's very kind of traditional anti-Semitism comes in here and there, starting with his childhood experiences, with what his nanny told him, that the Jews crucified Jesus and all of it. And he writes these stories down, and it clearly gives an impression on him. So we have these new rulers, I would say, in Bavaria who are conservative, Catholic, although von Kahr actually was not Catholic, he's Protestant. He did come from Franconia. And with some kind of, I would say, traditional, religiously influenced anti-Semitism. There is more to it. The courts. So the courts were not changed. They weren't changed by Eisner. They weren't changed later. It's the same judges and the same prosecutors as before 1918, as in the monarchy. They are, as one observer said, they were blind on their right eye. And of course, not all of them, not all the judges, but the majority of the judges they were inclined to give very hard sentences to left-wing political actors and be extremely mild to right-wing political actors. And that was also true for von Arco, the assassin of Kurt Eisner, of the prime minister. It was obviously that he had killed him, and there was only one verdict he was supposed to give, and that was the death penalty, because for killing the prime minister, there was no other way. And he did. But the next day, he changed it to a life sentence. And in the end, von Arco was out of prison after 4 or 5 years, depending if you take the whatever. In 1924, he was freed. And also, the moment he changed the sentence from death sentence, the students of the University of Munich interrupted, when they heard about it, they interrupted all the lectures and they were jubilant. So the assassin became the hero. The right-wing patriot had killed the left-wing revolutionary. For many people in the conservative parts of Munich, it was now the right-wingers who had brought down the revolution, even with murder, who became the heroes. What about the police? You see in this picture, next to the Prime Minister von Kahr, on the right side, a guy called Pöhner. Pöhner was the police chief of Munich, already starting 1919, and he happened to be one of the earliest Nazis. When the Nazi Party was founded in 1920, he became a close associate, and he was one of the people who would later, he was no longer police president then, but he would march with Hitler in 23 in the beer hall putsch. And he wasn't the only one. There were other known Nazis in the Munich police leadership. For example, the leader of the political police in Munich became Minister of Justice under Hitler in 1933. So you have the courts, you have the police, you have the politicians, and you have the church leadership, all kind of inclined to be not favorable towards the Jewish population. And Jews knew that. Jews of Munich knew that. And you can see some of the election posters here with these anti-Semitic faces asking, saying they are the real masters of Germany. And of course, totally, and some of them, by the way, are not even Jewish. And the Munich Jews, knowing that, were in a difficult situation, especially when violence started to happen. Violence started, as so often, it starts against the weakest elements of society. These were the East European Jews in Munich. I don't even say immigrants, because many of them were already born in Germany or in Munich, but they still were not German citizens because you didn't get your citizenship right by birth necessarily. That was not a right you had until, by the way, the year 2000. They were about 20% of Munich's population, many of them poor, with shops like this one. And when von Kahr, conservative politician, becomes prime minister in 1920, he starts a campaign against or in favor of expelling them. Well, we all know right-wing politicians are in favor of expelling whatever they consider illegal immigrants, right? Whatever, or however horrible this term is. And that's what von Kahr did, and it was aimed at East European Jews. What did the Munich Jewish community do? Well, they knew that courts will not be much of a help for us. Neither will the police be, nor the church and the politicians. And this happened both, by the way, 1920, and then when he came back as the dictator in 1923. And it's interesting how in the end these expulsions of East European Jews were prevented, with few exceptions. A few were expelled. By the way, who was supposed to be expelled? All those who had the tiniest, record, could be any minor issue, but whoever was on record for having not paid their fines or their taxes, or even then, back then you had parking, not too many people had cars or anything, but you had traffic tickets, you had all kinds of things. And everybody was on record with the police was supposed to be expelled. How did the Jewish community, and I must say the Bavarian Jewish community, the majority, they did want to come to help, because they realized, first it's the East European Jews, then it's us. They turned to the foreign missions. In that case, I found interesting documents in the Austrian embassy the Austrian Foreign Office in Vienna. So the Austrian consulate in Munich was involved, because many of them would have been expelled to Austria. Before the war, many of them were citizens of Austria, the Habsburg Empire. And Austria said, well, they didn't want, take immigrants back. They said, well, if you send us these people, then we will send Bavarians back to Bavaria. And so did the Poles. And then the Americans, and that was actually really interesting findings here in DC, in the National Archives. Some American Jews of German background wrote to the Secretary of State in Washington. The Secretary of State wrote to the ambassador in Berlin, saying, what is happening in Munich? Are these anti-Semitic events actually happening? And then the ambassador wrote to the consul general in Munich. And by the way, there is some anti-Semitic language in the foreign office back then as well. But in the end, it was clear that the US also tried to intervene and say, you cannot expel these people. In the end, that helped. All of those foreign inventions of the foreign embassies, in my judgment at least, helped more than anything else to not go ahead with these expulsions. I'm coming slowly to the end. So why is all this so important in a city like Munich? Well, it happened to be that was the place where a person called Adolf Hitler lived. And that's where he, as he later said in Mein Kampf, in his writing, that here, he said, was the beginning of my political activity. He connected it in Mein Kampf to the rule of the Jews of the time of the revolution. He returned to Munich as a soldier in World War I in December of 1918. As you know, he was Austrian, but he had moved to Munich before World War I. So honestly, we don't know if that's true. Was he anti-Semitic before? Probably, but he has not written anything. He has not given any public speeches until the fall of 1919. Only then do we know that he comes out in strong anti-Semitic terms. There are some historians who argue in early 1919, he was still playing a role in the left-wing councils of the revolution. Probably not, but there are some indications. There's even a picture people identified him, but then others said, it's not him. It's not totally clear. It doesn't matter that much, but all we know is that Hitler, as a public person, appeared at the same time as the revolution was shut down. In the fall of 1919, he gives his first speeches. In 1920, party we call today the Nazi Party is started. It was called, of course, different. He takes it over a year later, and he wasn't the founder of the party. He renames it and takes it over. And it's very fast that Hitler, who speaks, like you can see here, in many of the beer halls of Munich, it's very fast. His rise is very fast. By the summer of 1923, Thomas Mann, whom we have encountered in a different function before, calls Munich, actually in an article he writes for an American journal, Munich, he says, is the city of Hitler. Now that's an interesting statement in June of 1923. Hitler has no political function. He's the leader of what seems a rather obscure right-wing movement. But it's not that obscure anymore. They have posters all over the town. They have marches. They are in their uniforms. They're very visible and audible. And another thing Thomas Mann wrote a few years later gives you a sense of the transformation of the city. In 1926, he says, Munich changed from a center of cheerful sensuality, artistry, and joie de vivre to a city decried as a hotbed of reaction, as a seat of all stubbornness, a city that could only be described as a stupid city, and indeed as the stupidest city of all. That's Thomas Mann, a citizen of Munich, by the way. You can imagine, didn't make him so popular among many people there. That's what he wrote in 1926. And indeed, by then, and by 1923, Munich had become the hotbed of right-wing extremism and of all the movements that were on the right-wing spectrum. Very different from what Munich was before World War I, as a very liberal, open-minded city of the arts, and Berlin was rather seen as a city more of a military, the Prussian traditions. So I'm ending with the last act of these 5 acts, the beer hall putsch of November 8th and 9th, 1923. Or let's call it an insurrection, because that's what it was. Munich was used by Hitler as a testing ground for the rise of his new national movement. By 1923, there were thousands of people in his the speeches he gave. And he was ready to take over. And he, of course, was ready to take over not just Munich, but Berlin. What happened on November 8th, 1923? Von Kahr, the little dictator of Munich, gave a speech in a beer hall. And during the speech, it was, by the way, the 5th anniversary, November 8th, 9th, of the end of the war and the revolution. He gave the speech, and during the speech, Hitler and his comrades storm into the beer hall with their guns in their hands. They're shooting into the ceiling, and they disappear with von Kahr and some of the other government representatives of Bavaria into a smaller back room. After a short time, they all came back, and they declared they're now working together towards a restoration of, of the conservative and right-wing forces of Germany, of Bavaria and of Germany. And they would march toward Berlin. But first they had to take over Munich. So Hitler was with his troops in the city of Munich. You see the city hall down here, where actually Julius Streicher, one of the worst anti-Semites, gave a speech. What happened? In the morning, von Kahr decided to go against Hitler and had his police and his troops shoot against the Nazi troops and tried to seize also Hitler. Did he change his mind, or was he never allied at that evening with Hitler? We will never know. Hitler always thought and claimed that von Kahr was with him, and he changed his mind. Von Kahr said, well, that was under duress. I couldn't have done it differently. Whatever the case was, in the morning, early days of the next morning, in the early hours of the next morning, the revolution comes, this insurrection, sorry, comes to an end. And Hitler has to flee Munich. He goes to one of the nearby lakes. He's discovered there, and he's put to trial. By the way, it is the same judge who gave the mild sentence to the murderer of Eisner, Count von Arco. Now we have the same judge giving a very mild sentence to a person who tried insurrection against the Bavarian state. And what is the sentence? Hitler, and I'm really making this, trying to abbreviate this because it was much more complicated. Also, who were the others in this insurrection? Von Ludendorff, one of the generals of World War I. Hitler is getting is being imprisoned, but the prison isn't really a prison as you would imagine it. The picture taken here, the picture on top, is the picture in prison. You don't see prisoners' clothes. They sit on a very nice table with tablecloth. He has all his friends. You see Rudolf Hess, his later deputy, sitting at the table, and others. I would call it the writer's retreat, because in the short time he was in this place in Landsberg, about a year, he wrote Mein Kampf under these conditions, as you can see them there. So in December of 1924, Hitler was already a free man again. And he started his political career again. And as we all know, 9 years later, in 1933, he now comes back, and he comes back in a very different way than 10 years earlier. He is now the strongman of Germany, and soon will call himself the Führer. And his testing ground in Munich worked pretty well. He could see how far he could go, and he could go very far without much happening to him. And that was the prologue in my interpretation of what happened after 1933. But that's not our topic. And here is more reading if you want to. And I hope you all have questions. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, Michael, for a truly illuminating talk. We don't have a lot of time, so we can just take a couple of questions. In the Q&A, Michael, maybe you want to... Oh, wait, there are some. Okay, I'm going to read it to you. Was the Jewish communism looked at as worse than the new fascism by Germany, and was that a strong element of its rise? I assume the rise of fascism.
Well, it depends by whom, of course. By the conservative forces, yes, and by the Catholic Church. And that's also important. You know, there are other very interesting players I didn't mention. One was Eugenio Pacelli, who was the papal nuntius, papal ambassador in Munich. He would later become Pope Pius, the Pope who was the Pope during the Holocaust. And one of the sources you can also read online by now are the letters he wrote, and they're quite not just anti-communist when he's in Munich in 1918-19, but they also they have some, I would say, clearly anti-Semitic undertones to it. So the Catholic Church is an important player in responding to your question, in seeing it that way. And they see it really that way. Now, I should say, just to get this right, most of them were not communists. There was only a short phase, the last phase of this revolution with this one guy, Eugen Leviné, as a leader. But most of those people were not communists. They didn't want to have a Moscow-style, Soviet republic. Otherwise, Eisner would not have called for elections and would not have been ready to resign. So it was not, they were not Trotsky and they were not Rosa Luxemburg. Those were socialists or maybe left-wing social democrats, but not communists.
Thank you. There's another excellent question, and I would imagine that this question has been on many minds. It certainly was on mine. Any takeaway that apply to current politics from your research? In other words, does history repeat or merely rhyme? Or neither?
It rhymes. I mean, yes, absolutely rhymes. It doesn't repeat itself. But I must say, the book came out. No, let's put that. I wrote the introduction to the English. I wrote it in German initially, but the English edition, I was writing the introduction in January of 2021, January 6th. What was it? 2021, right? And first I thought when I write this book, it's not so relevant for the American context. When I saw these pictures of January 6th, 2021, I couldn't help but think of 1923 in Munich. Here you have an insurrection. Here you have people who think that's all right, what's happening. And you have a leader who is not, who's not punished. And when you listen, and again, I want to make clear, there's huge differences. I want to make this clear. And Trump is not Hitler. I want to make this clear. But when you hear what the extreme right wing and Hitler said in 1920s, the main line is make Germany great again. That was the takeaway, if you put it on one line. At the expense of immigrants, at the expense, in that case, of minorities like the Jews. The economy, after 1933, the economy did, first of all, pretty well, but not for everyone. There were those who were taken out of the Volksgemeinschaft, of the group of these people who were no longer declared Germans. The populism, the style of the speeches, of course it rhymes. It doesn't repeat. It's different. It's a new populism. We see it also in other places, Hungary, Poland. I mean, even in Israel, you have, things that rhyme in terms of a new populism. But unfortunately, in this country, I see too, and I've never ever expected it. And I mean, you must be blind, I think, not to see the rhyming. So I think if we take one lesson, so we have to fight for democracy, and we have to fight at this moment before it's too late, because in 1937, you couldn't do much anymore. In 1933, maybe there was still a chance. Now, again, not the same. There was still opposition here. There was still, a liberty, express your opinion. You don't have concentration camps, obviously. But the attacks against democracy are, I find it scaring how it rhymes.
Yeah, and again, I suspect you're not the only one who was on this Zoom call. I would, if it's okay with you, Michael, I know you're in a different time zone. Can we take a couple more questions?
Sure. I am sorry I went a little bit over time.
No, it was great. But we have 3 more really interesting questions. So the next one is, you mentioned a reluctance within the German historical community to engage with the Jewish leadership of the revolution due to far-right associations. Do you find this hesitancy to be more common within German historical circles, or have you found it extend to other studies, such as Jewish studies, more broadly?
Sorry, I think I have to sneeze. No. Okay, I'll just answer that till it comes. About scholarship, right? That was the
Yes, about the reluctance of German historians to tackle the Jewishness or the issue of so many Jewish leaders in the Munich Revolution or the Bavarian Revolution.
Look, I think it's a very delicate question. I mean, that's obvious. I felt that too when I wrote about it. And for non-Jewish historians, that is even worse. How do you do justice to this topic without falling in the trap of giving material to this, communist Jewish almost conspiracy theory? The Nazis always loved to exploit that. For them, all the revolutionaries were communists and were Jews in Munich and in Berlin and everywhere and in Moscow and in Petersburg. Of course, that wasn't true. In Munich, it was a large part. So I think, as a historian, you have to face it. You can't, it's not, I'm very careful in the book not to make it, make Hitler a result of the Jewish participation in the revolution. He might have emerged in any case. He might have come out, he might have had different reasons. But we can't deny that this happened, and we have to write the history. That's what Martin Buber wrote. That's what Gustav Landau wrote to Martin Buber already in December of 1918. And I think it is possible today, and we don't have to transport anti-Semitic, ideas by doing this. I think as historians, we try to write the history in all its complexities, and that's what I hoped I did. I just something which is maybe more of a matter of style, but it gives you an idea of how I approach the topic. So I actually start each chapter with a Jewish holiday. And I found a nice story for all of the chapters where things happen on Jewish holidays. And for example, one of those revolutionaries, Erich Mühsam, wrote a wonderful poem about Christmas and Hanukkah. But also on Sukkot, 1923, there was some of the Sukkot, of the huts, were burned by Nazis already in 1923. And I found another, I think that was very obscure. I had not seen it anywhere else, but I found a reference to the fact that a second Purim, which is a remembrance day, which was often declared by local rabbis after a community was saved from danger, was declared by the Munich Orthodox rabbi in 1923 because Munich Jews were saved from a pogrom in already November 8th, 9th, like 15 years later, 1938, Kristallnacht. In 1923, and if you read some of the scenes that happened, the local Nazis, they took some Jews in the middle of the night out of their houses. They took hostages among the Jewish community and among socialists. So some of the stories were very scary, and the rabbi declared a local Jewish holiday in 1923, which, by the way, ironically, he said it should be celebrated only for the period of 10 years. So kind of ironically, by 1933, everything's supposed to be good again.
Okay, final question. And by the way, you're getting a lot of really positive feedback, which is not a surprise. So the final question was: the conservative Jewish community in Munich that opposed Eisner, did it believe that they would be immune from oppression by the opponents of the socialists?
I think they hoped that a moderate party, a moderate stream, would be the dominant force emerging. But that didn't happen. It changed from left wing to right wing. Again, not to the Nazis, but to a pretty conservative right wing party. I found it very interesting looking into these letters, which are really fascinating. By the way, often with with drawings and horrible drawings, like Eisner on a gallows and things like that. But then the Jews writing to Eisner, one of them said, well, you should really not be prime minister because you put us, the Jews, in danger. And you know what was the most interesting thing? Eisner took the time. I mean, he was only prime minister for 3 months. He actually had a lot to do. He took the time to answer this gentleman, because that letter we also have somewhere else. And he says, what do you think? You think I would be prime minister of Bavaria if all I worried about is what effect will this have on the Jews? I am the prime minister of all Bavarians, and you should not be so scared. And I found it remarkable that he just answered that letter. There were several of these letters, and I assume he didn't answer all of them, which I found. But the idea was usually, we're scared. Would they have believed that the right wing would be better? No, but they had hoped that like the more centrist parties would emerge victorious.
Well, thank you again very, very much for a fascinating talk. And I think we all learned a lot. Thank you all for attending. And before you leave, please note that on April 4th, we will host Professor Jeffrey Kopstein for a virtual talk titled Politics, Violence, Memory, the New Social Science of the Holocaust. I hope you can join us. I will send out a reminder and a sign-up link. I hope everybody has a good night. Thank you again. And thank you, Michael, for a very, very interesting talk.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.